This time it's 5 classic British two-strokes. Now for some people, the phrase classic British two-stroke is a contradiction in terms, and it's a phrase often uttered by people who probably never even actually sat on one. But the fact is, historically speaking, British two-strokes have at times been pioneering, creative and really ahead of their time. So let's look back at 5 really great examples of the great British two-stroke. S.O.S. For almost 90 years until 2017, on Stratford Street near Birmingham, you would have found the dealership of Vale Onslow. The business was set up by one Len Vale Onslow in 1926, but it was also at this time that he designed his own frame and began to manufacture a motorcycle of his very own, which he called the S.O.S. or Super Onslow Special, with the tagline "So obviously superior." The frame-line design was extremely lightweight and very effective, so he decided to throw all the gadgets he possibly could to make the best possible Villiers motorcycle that could be made at that time. These included liquid cooling and on some machines automatic oiling. Yes, both of those things were available on two-strokes before the Japanese turned up. Now while early machines from 1927 onwards of course used air-cooled engines, some of which were 4-stroke Jap engines, from 1933 they introduced these liquid-cooled models. These were available from 172 to 250 cc's. Later that year, Len would sell the business to Tommy Meaton, a successful TT racer, and he would expand the range further to a 346cc liquid-cooled two-stroke. Other developments would include the use of the flat-top piston 249cc engine in 1935. The little water-cooled 250 would be popular in competition, and was regarded as one of the best 250s available at that time. But unfortunately it all ended when the factory was bombed in 1939. The Scott Parallel Twins. Possibly the most influential motorcycle company in the history of the two-stroke, Scott Motorcycles was founded by one Alfred Angus Scott in Saltaire, Yorkshire in 1908. Scott would later say that his apprenticeship working with high-pressure steam engines would influence him towards the use of two-strokes, in particular those two-stroke parallel twins. In 1901 he would design his first engine, which he would fit into a Premier bicycle frame. He patented his first parallel twin two-stroke design in 1904 and would insert this in a frame of his own design in 1908. This first design featured that biscuit barrel design fuel tank, the open frame, and had a 450cc engine and a 2-speed transmission system which actually used 2 gears and a sort of rocking lever where the footboard was that he used to control the transmission. Now I've ridden one of these machines and they are quite difficult to ride, but the performance is really very much on the next level for a machine of this age. Over the next few years the machine would grow slightly in size, going from 500, 550 and eventually to 600 cc's, and would be extremely successful in competition, both reliability trials and racing. And in 1910 they would make history by being the first two-strokes to complete the TT course, and they returned the following year and set a lap record of just over 50 miles an hour. They would later win the TT in 1912 and 1913. And incredibly, these TT machines even made use of rotary valve induction. But wait, Scott didn't just give us the first parallel twin liquid-cooled two-stroke with rotary valves in racing, as it turned out. They also gave us the kickstart and upside-down telescopic forks in the 1920s. So Scott, the greatest two-stroke manufacturer ever? Quite possibly. Greaves motorcycles. Now you may or you may not be aware of a YouTube channel called Hubnut. In that, a slightly eccentric British guy drives around in an Invacar. Now the Invacar was developed by a guy called Bert Greaves. Bert Greaves had a cousin called Derry Preston Cobb who was disabled and designed a car for him. He then won a contract with the government to supply Invacars to disabled war veterans. He used the profits of this to begin motorcycle production in 1952. The company specialised in off-road machines and were extremely good at it. In fact, Some of the best trials and motocross machines of the 50s and 60s were built by Greaves. Now the company typically used customer engines by Villiers or British Anzani, although later on they would design their own competition unit. Now not surprisingly, their road-going two-strokes often used Villiers engines off the shelf, but used frame and suspension parts straight from their off-roaders, hence the somewhat unusual suspension system that you often see on Greaves. This may look a bit odd, but it's very effective. The main spar is an aluminium casting to which the rest of the frame is bolted, all making for a very rigid and lightweight setup. So basically these bikes are about as good as you can get with a Villiers powered machine, and as a consequence can command surprisingly high prices. During the 70s the company concentrated on their off-roaders such as the Greaves Griffin, a bike they would carry through to the end of the line in 1976. It's the Aerial Arrow. In 1958, Ariel's design team of Val Page and Bernard Knight surprised the world when they dropped their four-stroke machines in favour of a 250 parallel twin two-stroke. Not only that, but they housed the engine in a pressed steel frame, which made use of an unusual suspension system and had, even more amazingly, fully enclosed bodywork. Optional extras included indicators, in 1958, and purpose-made colour-matched panniers. There are those that will tell you the leader was a flop. It's not actually true, it sold in pretty good numbers. But nevertheless, the company did expand its range by offering a cheaper version with all the bodywork stripped away, and this was of course the Arrow. And this model would appear in 1959, with a smaller 200cc version arriving in 1964. But in between times, in 1961, a more interesting version, the Arrow Sport, or the S model, or sometimes just known as the Golden Arrow, was introduced in 1961. And for this version they did do a bit of tuning work. Whilst the standard leader had a top speed of around 74 miles an hour and a cruising speed of around 60, the Golden Arrow could hit 81 miles an hour and produced a claimed 20 horsepower at the rear wheel. Now I was amazed to see recently that an article listing the top 10 worst motorcycles ever built included the Aerial Leader and Arrow series. This is absolute and complete nonsense. I've ridden one of these machines, and despite what the article said, handling is extremely good, way above what most 250s of the era could manage, as was ground clearance. Believe me, there was no Japanese bike at that time that could actually match this thing through a corner. They may have had a little bit more top speed, but they certainly couldn't out-corner the Arrow. And remember, this was effectively a late 50s design. Now the Arrow used a 247cc parallel twin two-stroke engine with a bore and stroke of 54 by 54. This engine was then hung from that pressed steel frame on rubber mounts, meaning that when you rode along there was virtually no vibration at all. That beautiful golden fuel tank is merely a storage compartment. The fuel tank itself is actually under the seat and holds around 3 gallons. And this would be enough to give the bike a range of almost 200 miles, thanks to its very good fuel consumption by two-stroke standards at least. But unfortunately the market was turning against bikes like the Aerial. Simply put, the British motorcycle market, and not just the industry, was in a state of collapse. From 1959 onwards, sales of bikes plummeted, as people moved on to small cars like the Mini and the Ford Popular. And this was in the years even before the arrival of the Japanese. And as a result, Aerial's owners BSA would simply close the factory in 1965 rather than invest money in updating the machine. The BSA Bantam. Now in all fairness, you could accuse me of cheating here because of course the BSA Bantam is based on the DKW RT125, so in principle you could describe it as a German two-stroke, in principle at least. But BSA would mirror the design of the RT, reversing the controls to a more British standard, and also would develop the machine in their own direction during the 1950s and 60s, culminating in the 175 models of the late 60s. The B175 single-cylinder engine would produce around 13 horsepower at the back wheel, enough to see the bike up to around 65 miles an hour. And with that lightweight frame, the Bantam was a very nimble little motor. Now we did own a D14 for a while and can testify that the bike is pretty rapid for its size. But unfortunately it wasn't perfect. High compression both at the bottom and top end of the engine meant starting was surprisingly difficult for such a small motor, and it wasn't the most reliable bike we've ever owned. BSA were clearly aware of some of these problems, and in 1969 introduced the B175, which ironed out most of the issues. And unfortunately the B175 would be the last of the Bantams. A Bantam 2 model had been in development for some time, but was never completed due to the problems within the company. It seems that BSA's somewhat incompetent management by this point had completely lost interest in small machines. And when approached by a small consortium who wanted to use the Bantam engine in trials work, the company simply smashed the tooling up to prevent its use. Absolute madness. So what other bikes or collections of bikes would you like us to see or do a video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.